Elizabeth Harper stood in the doorway of her small cabin, watching 3 dust clouds grow larger on the horizon. Her heart sank as she recognized the riders approaching her homestead in the New Mexico territory. The man in the center was Marcus Blackwood, a wealthy rancher who had loaned her late husband money 2 years ago. The debt that had seemed manageable when Thomas was alive now felt like a mountain she could never climb. Behind her, she could hear her 3-year-old triplets playing on the wooden floor. Emma, Samuel, and little Grace had no idea that their world was about to change forever. Elizabeth had tried so hard to keep the farm running after Thomas died of fever 8 months ago. But the crops had failed, the well had run dry, and now winter was coming with no money for supplies. The riders stopped in front of her cabin, their horses snorting and pawing at the dusty ground. Marcus Blackwood dismounted, his expensive boots hitting the earth with authority. He was a large man with cold gray eyes and a mouth that rarely smiled. The 2 men with him stayed on their horses, hands resting casually on their gun belts. "Mrs. Harper," Marcus said, tipping his hat slightly. "I believe you know why I'm here." Elizabeth lifted her chin, trying to appear braver than she felt. "Mr. Blackwood, I told you I need more time. The harvest should bring in enough to make a payment." Marcus looked around the small property, taking in the withered corn stalks and the broken fence posts. "What harvest, Mrs. Harper? This land is played out. Your husband borrowed $800 from me, and you haven't paid a cent in 6 months." "I've been trying," Elizabeth said desperately. "The children need me. I can't leave them too." "Work in town, that's not my problem," Marcus replied coldly. "A debt is a debt. Your husband signed papers putting this land up as collateral. Since you can't pay, the property belongs to me now." Elizabeth felt the world spinning around her. "Please, Mr. Blackwood, give me until spring. I'll find a way to pay you back." Marcus shook his head. "I've been more than patient, Mrs. Harper, but I have a business proposition for you." Elizabeth's stomach clenched. She had heard rumors about Marcus Blackwood's business propositions, and none of them ended well for the people involved. "There's an Apache chief named Ayanna, who's been causing trouble for the territorial governor," Marcus continued. "He's been raiding supply trains and making it difficult for settlers to move through his territory. The army hasn't been able to catch him, but they're willing to pay good money for information about his whereabouts." "I don't understand what this has to do with me," Elizabeth said, though she was beginning to fear she did. "Ayanna has a weakness for helping people in distress, especially women and children. If you were to encounter him while traveling through his territory, he might take you and your children under his protection. You could learn his habits, his camp locations, his plans." Elizabeth stared at Marcus in horror. "You want me to spy on an Apache chief? To betray someone who might help my children?" "I want you to pay your debt," Marcus said simply. "You do this for me and we'll call it even. Refuse, and you and those children will be off my land by sunset." The sound of little feet running across the floor made Elizabeth turn. Emma appeared in the doorway, her blonde curls catching the afternoon sunlight. She looked up at the strange men with wide blue eyes. "Mama," she said uncertainly. Elizabeth scooped her daughter up, holding her close. Behind Emma, Samuel, and Grace peeked out from behind the doorframe, sensing their mother's distress. "Think about it, Mrs. Harper," Marcus said, remounting his horse. "Those children need food and shelter. Winter's coming, and the nearest town is 50 miles away. You have no money, no family, and no options. I'm offering you a way to keep your children alive. And if I refuse to betray this Apache chief once I meet him?" Elizabeth asked. Marcus smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then you'll have learned that crossing Marcus Blackwood was the last mistake you ever made." After the men rode away, Elizabeth sat on her front step, with her 3 children gathered around her. Emma had fallen asleep in her lap, while Samuel played with wooden blocks their father had carved, and Grace sucked her thumb while leaning against Elizabeth's shoulder. Elizabeth looked out at the failing farm that had been her home for 5 years. Thomas had been so proud when they first claimed this land, so sure they could build a good life here. Now she was facing an impossible choice: betray a stranger who might show her kindness, or watch her children starve. That night, after putting the triplets to bed, Elizabeth sat at her kitchen table and tried to think of alternatives. She could try to make it to the nearest town, but but 50 miles was a long way to travel with 3 small children and no supplies. She could try to find work, but who would hire a woman with triplets? She could write to her sister in Missouri. But even if Margaret agreed to help, it would take weeks for a letter to reach her, and more weeks for any help to arrive, as she sat in the lamplight. Elizabeth remembered the stories she had heard about the Apache leader called Ayanna. Unlike some of the other chiefs who were known for their violence, Ayanna was said to be a man of honor who protected the innocent. Some settlers claimed he had helped lost travelers find their way to safety. Others said he had shared food with hungry families passing through his territory. If those stories were true, then Marcus Blackwood was asking her to betray a good man. But if she refused, her children would suffer. Elizabeth looked toward the bedroom where Emma, Samuel, and Grace slept peacefully, unaware that their mother was wrestling with a decision that would change all their lives forever. By morning, Elizabeth had made her choice. She would pack what few belongings they could carry and head toward Apache territory. But she promised herself that when she met this chief named Ayanna, she would find a way to protect both her children and the man who might be their salvation. 3 days later, Elizabeth loaded her few possessions into their old wagon and helped her children climb onto the wooden seat beside her. She had sold everything of value except Thomas's rifle and their mother's wedding ring, which she kept hidden in a small pouch around her neck. The money from selling their furniture and livestock would buy supplies for the journey. But it wouldn't last long. Emma sat between her mother and Samuel, while Grace dozed in Elizabeth's lap. The triplets had accepted their mother's explanation that they were going on an adventure to find a new home. 3 years old, they trusted her completely. Having no idea of the danger they were heading toward, the wagon creaked along the dusty trail toward the mountains where Apache territory began. Elizabeth had studied the maps in town and knew they would reach the foothills by evening. After that, they would be in Ayanna's domain, where anything could happen. As the sun began to set behind the peaks ahead, Elizabeth made camp in a small clearing beside a stream. She unhitched their old mare, Bessie, and let the children play in the shallow water while she prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread. The triplets laughed and splashed, their joy a bright spot in Elizabeth's growing anxiety. That night, she lay awake, listening to every sound in the darkness. An owl hooted in the distance, and somewhere a coyote howled at the moon. The children slept peacefully under the wagon, wrapped in their father's old blankets. But Elizabeth kept Thomas's rifle close at hand. The next morning brought their first sign that they were being watched. As Elizabeth was packing up their camp, she noticed fresh horse tracks near the stream. They hadn't been there the night before. Someone had approached their camp while they slept, close enough to water a horse, but had chosen not to disturb them. Throughout the morning, Elizabeth caught glimpses of movement in the rocks above the trail. She knew they were being followed, but whoever was watching them made no move to approach. The triplets remained oblivious, pointing excitedly at rabbits and birds along the way. By midday, the trail had become more difficult, winding through narrow canyons and rocky passages that made Elizabeth's palms sweat as she guided Bessie around dangerous turns. This was wild country, beautiful but unforgiving, where a wrong step could mean death. It was Samuel who first spotted the riders. "Mama, look," he said, pointing to a ridge above them. Elizabeth looked up to see 3 Apache warriors, silhouetted against the bright sky. They sat motionless on their horses, watching the wagon below. Even at this distance, Elizabeth could see they were armed and ready for anything. "Are they the good Indians or the bad Indians?" Emma asked innocently. Elizabeth's heart was pounding, but she tried to keep her voice calm. "There are no good or bad people, sweetheart, just people who make different choices." More riders appeared on the opposite ridge, and soon Elizabeth counted at least a dozen warriors surrounding them. They moved like shadows, appearing and disappearing behind rocks and trees. It was clear that escape was impossible, even if Elizabeth had wanted to try. The wagon rounded a bend and entered a wide valley where a small stream meandered between cottonwood trees. It was here that the Apache finally revealed themselves fully. Warriors emerged from behind rocks and trees, creating a circle around the wagon. Their faces were painted for war, and they carried bows, rifles, lenses. Elizabeth brought the wagon to a stop and held her children close. "Stay calm," she whispered to them. "Don't be afraid." But Grace began to cry, sensing her mother's fear, and Samuel reached for Elizabeth's hand. Only Emma seemed unafraid, staring at the warriors with curious blue eyes. One of the Apache rode forward, an older man with gray streaking his black hair. He wore a leather vest decorated with silver concos and carried himself with the authority of a leader. This had to be Ayanna, though he looked nothing like the savage monster Marcus. Blackwood had described. The Apache chief studied Elizabeth and her children for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. Then he spoke, but not in English. His words were in his native tongue, musical and flowing like the stream beside them. Elizabeth shook her head apologetically. "I'm sorry, I don't understand." Ayanna tilted his head, considering. Then he dismounted and approached the wagon slowly, his movements careful and non-threatening. When he reached them, he looked directly into Elizabeth's eyes and spoke a single word in English. "Lost." Elizabeth's throat was dry, but she managed to nod. "We're lost." Ayanna studied the children, taking in their dirty faces and worn clothes. He pointed to Grace, who was still crying softly, then made a gesture toward his mouth. Elizabeth understood he was asking if the children were hungry. "Yes," she whispered. "We're all hungry." Without another word, Ayanna turned and spoke to his warriors in their language. Several of them dispersed, while others dismounted and began setting up what appeared to be a camp. Elizabeth watched in amazement as they worked with quiet efficiency. Their earlier menacing appearance replaced by something that looked almost like hospitality. One of the younger warriors approached the wagon carrying a leather water bag and what appeared to be dried meat wrapped in cloth. He offered these to Elizabeth with a slight nod. She accepted them gratefully and immediately gave water to her children, who drank eagerly. As the afternoon progressed, Elizabeth began to realize that she and her children were not prisoners, but guests. The Apache had set up a comfortable camp with a fire for cooking and shelter from the wind. They shared their food freely and showed particular kindness to the triplets, gradually lost their fear and began to smile at their unexpected hosts. Ayanna himself said little, but Elizabeth noticed he watched everything. He saw how she cared for her children, how she made sure they ate before she took any food for herself, how she comforted them when they were scared. His eyes missed nothing, and Elizabeth began to understand that this was a man who judged people by their actions rather than their words. As evening approached, and the triplets fell asleep beside the fire, Elizabeth found herself sitting across from Ayanna in comfortable silence. The other warriors had withdrawn to give their chief privacy, but she could feel them watching from the shadows. Finally, Ayanna spoke. "You come to Apache land with children? Why?" Elizabeth took a deep breath. This was the moment of truth. The moment when she would have to choose between Marcus Blackwood's demands and her own conscience. "We have nowhere else to go," she said, simply, and realized it was the most honest thing she had said in days. Ayanna studied Elizabeth's face in the flickering firelight, searching for deception. When he found none, he nodded slowly and poured himself coffee from a battered pot that one of his warriors had produced. The liquid was strong and bitter, but Elizabeth accepted a cup gratefully when he offered it. "Your husband?" Ayanna asked, gesturing to her wedding ring. "Dead," Elizabeth replied softly. "Fever took him 8 months ago." "And the white men who sent you here?" Elizabeth nearly choked on her coffee. Ayanna's English was better than he had first let on, and his perception was razor sharp. She looked into his dark eyes and realized there was no point in lying. "Did you know? White woman does not come to Apache land alone unless she has no choice. But your eyes say you are not running from danger. You're running toward it." Ayanna sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Someone promised you something if you find me." Elizabeth glanced toward her sleeping children, then back at the Apache chief. "A man named Marcus Blackwood. He holds the debt on our land. He said if I could learn about your movements, your camp locations, he would forgive what we owe." "And you believed him?" "I had to," Elizabeth said desperately. "My children were going to starve. We had nothing left." Ayanna was quiet for several minutes, staring into the fire. When he spoke again, his voice was gentle but firm. "This man Blackwood, he did not tell you the whole truth." "What do you mean?" "The white soldiers have been searching for me for 2 years. They offer much gold for information about my people, but those who take their gold do not live long to enjoy it." Ayanna met her eyes. "Blackwood planned to let you find me, then sell what you learned. After that, you would know too much. He would not let you live." Elizabeth felt sick to her stomach as the truth sank in. Marcus Blackwood had never intended to honor their agreement. He had sent her and her children into Apache territory to die, knowing that if they survived long enough to gather information, he would kill them to keep his own involvement secret. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "'Cause you spoke?" "Truth to me," Ayanna replied. "And because your children are innocent?" Grace stirred in her sleep, and Elizabeth reached over to tuck the blanket more securely around her daughter's small form. When she looked up, she found Ayanna watching her with something that might have been respect. "What happens now?" Elizabeth asked. "That depends on you," Ayanna said. "You came here to spy on me. Will you do as Blackwood asked?" Elizabeth looked at this man who could have killed her and her children without a second thought, but instead had fed them and treated them with kindness. She thought about Marcus Blackwood's cold eyes and cruel smile, and she knew there was really no choice at all. "No," she said firmly. "I won't spy on you. Won't help anyone hurt you or your people." Ayanna nodded as if he had expected this answer. "Then you are welcome to stay with us as long as you need to. But you should know that life with the Apache is not easy. We move often, we live off the land, and we are always ready to fight those who would destroy us." "I don't know anything about living like that," Elizabeth admitted. "I don't know if I can keep up or if I can protect my children in this kind of life." "You protected them from a man who wanted to use them," Ayanna pointed out. "You chose honesty over safety. Those are the actions of a strong woman." Over the following days, Elizabeth began to understand what Ayanna meant. The Apache band numbered about 30 people, including warriors, women, children, and elders. They moved through the mountains like ghosts, leaving barely a trace of their passage. Their knowledge of the land was extraordinary, and they could find water, food, and shelter in places where Elizabeth would have seen only barren rock. The women of the tribe accepted Elizabeth and her children with cautious kindness. They showed her how to prepare food over an open fire, how to make clothes from deer hide, and how to recognize which plants were safe to eat. The triplets adapted quickly, as children do, learning Apache words and playing with the other children in the band. But it was Ayanna himself who became Elizabeth's greatest teacher. He spoke little, but his actions spoke volumes. He made sure she and her children had enough to eat, even when food was scarce. He assigned warriors to help her when the trail became too difficult for the old wagon. Most importantly, he treated her not as a burden, but as a valuable member of their community. Elizabeth began to notice other things about the Apache chief. He was younger than she had first thought, probably in his early 30s. Despite his fierce reputation, he was gentle with children and respectful to the elders. His warriors followed him not out of fear, but out of genuine loyalty and admiration. She also began to understand why the territorial government wanted him captured or killed. Under Ayanna's leadership, the Apache had successfully resisted efforts to force them onto reservations. They had protected their traditional hunting grounds and way of life through a combination of strategic raids and skillful evasion. He was not the bloodthirsty savage that white newspapers described, but a brilliant military leader fighting to preserve his people's freedom. One evening, as they camped beside a hidden spring in a canyon that seemed carved from red stone, Ayanna approached Elizabeth while she was helping her children prepare for bed. "Your son has the eyes of a warrior," he said, watching Samuel practice with a small bow one of the Apache boys had made for him. "I hope he never has to be one," Elizabeth replied. "All men must fight for what they believe in," Ayanna said. "The question is whether they fight for good things or bad things." "What do you fight for?" Elizabeth asked. Ayanna was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "I fight so that Apache children can grow up free, so that our old people can die in the land where they were born." so that our ways do not disappear from the earth. Elizabeth understood then why Marcus Blackwood and men like him were so determined to defeat Ayanna. It wasn't just about land or gold or political power. It was about two completely different ways of seeing the world. Only one could survive in the same place. That night, she lay under the stars with her children sleeping peacefully beside her. Elizabeth realized that her old life was truly over. She could never go back to the white settlements, not after learning the truth about Marcus Blackwood's intentions. But for the first time since Thomas died, she felt something like hope. For the future? 2 weeks had passed since Elizabeth and her children joined Ayanna's band, and she was beginning to feel like she might actually survive this new life. The triplets were thriving, their cheeks growing rosy from the mountain air and constant activity. Samuel had become fascinated with tracking animals, while Emma collected pretty stones and flowers. Grace, the baby of the three, had completely won over the Apache women with her sweet nature and ready smiles. Elizabeth herself was learning skills she never thought she would need. Her hands, once soft from indoor work, were now calloused from handling ropes and leather. She could start a fire in the rain, identify edible plants, and even help treat minor injuries with herbs the Apache women taught her to use. But it was her growing friendship with Ayanna that surprised her most. Despite the language barriers and cultural differences, it developed an easy companionship built on mutual respect and shared concern for their people's welfare. Ayanna often sought her opinion on matters affecting the camp, and Elizabeth found herself offering insights that sometimes proved valuable. On this morning, however, something was wrong. Elizabeth woke to find the camp unusually quiet with warriors moving about with grim expressions. Ayanna was nowhere to be seen, and when she asked one of the women what was happening, she received only worried looks and rapid, Apache words she couldn't understand. It was mid-morning when Ayanna finally returned, riding hard with 2 of his scouts. His face was set in hard lines, and Elizabeth could see anger burning in his dark eyes. Dismounted quickly and called for the war council, a gathering of the band's senior warriors and elders. Elizabeth was preparing the midday meal when Ayanna approached her. His usual calm demeanor was replaced by barely controlled fury. "We must move quickly," he said without preamble. "Soldiers are coming. Many soldiers with Apache guides who know our usual routes." Elizabeth's blood turned cold. "How do you know?" "My scouts captured a messenger riding to Fort Craig. The letter he carried was from your friend Blackwood." Ayanna's voice was bitter. "He has convinced the army that you discovered our location and escaped to report it. They are bringing 2 companies of cavalry and Apache trackers from the reservation." Elizabeth stared at him in horror. "But that's not true. I never escaped. I never sent any messages." "I know this," Ayanna said quietly. "But Blackwood does not need truth. He needs excuse to bring soldiers into Apache land. Your presence here, even though you chose to stay with us, gives him the reason he wanted." The implications hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. By trying to protect Ayanna and his people, she had inadvertently provided Marcus Blackwood with exactly what he needed to justify a military campaign against them. "This is my fault," she whispered. "I brought this danger to you." "No," Ayanna said firmly. "Blackwood brought this danger. You are not responsible for the lies of evil men." Around them, the camp was being broken down with practiced efficiency. The Apache could pack everything they owned and be moving within an hour when necessary. But Elizabeth could see the concern on their faces. This wasn't just another relocation. This was a flight from overwhelming force. "Where will we go?" Elizabeth asked. "There is a place deeper in the mountains. Caves where we can hide until the soldiers give up and go away." Ayanna paused, studying her face. "But it will be a hard journey for you and the children. It's very hard. And we may not have enough food for everyone if we must stay hidden a long time." Elizabeth understood what he wasn't saying. She and her children would be a burden on the band, using resources that might mean the difference between survival and starvation for others. The honorable thing would be to ask him to leave them behind. "Maybe you should take us to the soldiers," she said reluctantly. "If they think I escaped and reported your location, they'll expect to find me in the settlements, not still with you." Ayanna's eyes flashed with anger. "You think I would give you 2 men who plan to kill you?" I think you should do what's best for your people, Elizabeth replied. That's what a good leader does. And what kind of man abandons woman and children? Who trust him? Ayanna shot back. We take you with us. All of us together, or none. Before Elizabeth could respond, one of the young warriors came running up to Ayanna, speaking rapidly in Apache. Elizabeth caught the word for soldiers and saw Ayanna's expression grow even grimmer. They are closer than we thought, he said. 2 hours, maybe less. We go now. The next few hours were the most terrifying of Elizabeth's life. The Apache moved through terrain that seemed impossible to navigate, leading their horses along narrow ledges and through hidden passes that only they knew existed. Elizabeth rode with Grace in her arms, while Samuel and Emma clung tightly to her, their eyes wide with fear and excitement. Behind them, they could hear the distant sounds of the pursuing soldiers, horses neighing, men shouting orders, the rattle of equipment. The army was following their trail, guided by Apache trackers who knew the land almost as well as Ayanna's people did. By late afternoon, they reached the caves Ayanna had mentioned. The entrance was hidden behind a curtain of vines and could only be reached by a treacherous climb up a rocky slope. The Apache began moving their horses and supplies up the narrow path. While Ayanna organized a rear guard to watch for approaching soldiers, Elizabeth struggled up the slope with her children, her legs shaking from exhaustion and fear. Halfway up, she stumbled and nearly fell, but strong hands caught her and helped her regain her footing. She looked up to see Ayanna beside her, his face showing concern despite the desperate situation. I can carry one of the children, he offered. Elizabeth was about to refuse when she heard the sound that made her blood freeze, the bugle call of approaching cavalry, echoing off the canyon walls below them. The soldiers had found their trail and were closing in fast. Take Grace, Elizabeth said, handing him her youngest daughter. I can manage the other two. Ayanna took the little girl gently, and Grace, who had grown comfortable with the Apache chief over the past weeks, went to him without protest. Together, they climbed the remaining distance to the cave entrance. Inside, the caves were larger than Elizabeth had expected, with multiple chambers connected by narrow passages. The Apache had obviously used this hideout before, as there were supplies cached in the deeper chambers and areas, set up for cooking and sleeping. But even as they settled in for what might be a long siege, Elizabeth could hear the soldiers below, searching the canyon floor and calling out to each other as they found signs of the Apache's passage. It would only be a matter of time before they discovered the hidden entrance to the caves. Ayanna gathered his warriors for a hushed conference. While the women and children were settled as far back in the caves as possible, Elizabeth could see the weight of decision on his shoulders. The terrible choice between fighting a battle they couldn't win and trying to find another way to escape. When he returned to where she sat with her children, his expression was resigned, but determined. There may be another way out, he said quietly. Old passage, very dangerous, that leads to next valley. But some of us must stay behind to make soldiers think we are all here, or they will follow too quickly. Elizabeth understood immediately. You're going to stay behind, someone must. And I will not ask any of my warriors to do what I will not do myself. Looking at this man who had shown her and her children nothing but kindness, Elizabeth felt something shift in her heart. This wasn't just about gratitude anymore, or even friendship. Somewhere along the way, she had begun to care about Ayanna in a way that had nothing to do with debt or survival. The night in the caves was the longest of Elizabeth's life. Outside, they could hear the soldiers setting up camp, their voices echoing off the canyon walls as they prepared for what their commander clearly expected to be a siege. Hidden chambers, the Apache waited in tense silence, mothers comforting frightened children, while warriors checked their weapons and prepared for whatever morning might bring. Elizabeth sat with her triplets, pressed close to her sides, trying to keep them calm despite her own racing heart. Samuel kept asking why they had to whisper, while Emma wanted to know when they could go outside and play. Only Grace seemed to understand that something serious was happening, staying unusually quiet and clinging to her mother's dress. Near midnight, Ayanna appeared beside them like a shadow. In the dim light from the carefully shielded fire deeper in the cave, Elizabeth could see the strain on his face. The passage to the next valley, he said quietly. My scouts have checked it, It is clear, but very narrow in places. Some of the older people, the small children, they will need help.
Ow.
What about you? Elizabeth asked, though she already knew the answer. I stay with 6 warriors. Make noise, keep soldiers thinking we are all here until sunrise. Then we try to follow, but he shrugged. A gesture that said more than words about their chances of survival. Elizabeth looked at her sleeping children, then back at Ayanna. The thought of leaving him behind felt like a knife twisting in her chest. Over the past weeks, she had come to depend on his strength and wisdom in ways she was only now beginning to understand. There has to be another way, she said desperately. Ayanna knelt beside her, his voice gentle but firm. There is no other way. My people must survive. Children, the women, the elders who carry our stories and traditions, they are the future. I am just one man. You're their leader. They need you. Need to live more than they need me. Ayanna reached out and touched Emma's hair as she slept. Your children, too. They deserve to grow up free, to choose their own path in life. Before Elizabeth could respond, one of the Apache women approached and spoke quietly to Ayanna in their language. He nodded and stood up. It is time, he said. The escape passage is ready. The next hour was a nightmare of whispered commands and careful movement through narrow rock passages. The Apache moved like ghosts, carrying their elderly and helping their children through openings that sometimes required crawling on hands and knees. Elizabeth struggled to keep her triplets quiet and moving, her heart breaking every time. Of them whimpered in fear or confusion. The passage seemed to go on forever, winding through the heart of the mountain. In some places, it opened into chambers large enough for the entire group, while in others, it had to move single file through cracks barely wide enough for an adult to squeeze through. Finally, after what felt like hours, Elizabeth saw starlight. Ahead, they emerged from the mountain on the opposite side of the ridge, in a valley the soldiers would never think to search. The cool night air felt like freedom. After the suffocating closeness of the caves, but even as the Apache began to organize themselves for the next phase of their journey, Elizabeth found herself looking back toward the mountain that separated them from Ayanna. Somewhere on the other side, he was preparing to face overwhelming odds. To buy time for their escape, dawn was breaking over the eastern peaks when they heard the gunfire start. The sharp crack of rifles echoed across the valleys, punctuated by war cries and shouted orders. The battle had begun. Elizabeth gathered her children close, trying to shield them from the sounds of violence. But she couldn't stop herself from listening to every shot, wondering if each one might be the one that took Ayanna's life. The Apache. Around her were equally tense, torn between the need to keep moving to safety and the desire to know the fate of their chief. The gunfire continued for nearly an hour, before gradually tapering off to occasional shots, then silence. The kind of silence that could mean victory or death, and no way to know which, by mid-morning. They had put several miles between themselves and the mountain, following game trails that would leave minimal tracks for any pursuers to follow. The Apache traveled in a long, strung-out line with scouts ranging ahead, and behind to watch for soldiers or other dangers. It was one of these scouts who brought the news Elizabeth had been dreading. He rode up to the main group, his horse lathered with sweat, and spoke rapidly to the war leader who had taken command in Ayanna's absence. Elizabeth didn't need to understand Apache to read the expressions on their faces. What is it? What is it? One of the women who spoke some English? 7 soldiers dead, but Ayanna and his warriors are captured, the woman replied, her voice heavy with grief. They are taken to Fort Craig. Elizabeth felt the world spin around her. Largest military post in the territory, and everyone knew what happened to Apache warriors who were taken there. They would be tried by a military tribunal and executed, or if they were lucky, sent to prison camps where they would die slowly of disease and despair. That evening, as the band made camp in another hidden canyon, Elizabeth made a decision that surprised even herself. She approached the war leader, a grizzled older man named Nathan, who commanded the respect of all the warriors. I want to go to Fort Craig, she said. Nathan studied her with sharp eyes. Why would you do such a thing? Are safe now. Your children are safe. Because this is my fault, Elizabeth replied. Ayanna was captured because he stayed behind to save us. The soldiers are there because Marcus Blackwood used me as an excuse to hunt your people. I have to try to help. You are one white woman. What can you do against a fort full of soldiers? Elizabeth had been thinking about this all day. I can tell them the truth. I can testify that I was never held captive, that I stayed with your people by choice. I can expose Marcus Blackwood's lies and maybe save Ayanna's life. Natan shook his head. The white soldiers will not listen to you. Will think you are a crazy woman, or that Apache magic has made you forget your own people. Maybe, Elizabeth admitted, but I have to try. I can't live knowing that a good man died because of my actions. And your children? What happens to them if you go to the soldiers? Elizabeth looked across the camp to where Emma, Samuel, and Grace were playing with some of the Apache children. Laughing and chattering in a mixture of English and Apache words they had picked up. They were happy here, accepted and loved by people who had become their extended family. Will you take care of them if something happens to me? She asked. Natan was quiet for a long time, studying her face in the firelight. Finally, he nodded. Slowly, Apache children, or white children, it makes no difference. We protect all children. But Elizabeth, you should know if you go to the soldiers, you probably will not come back. I know, she said quietly. But some things are more important than staying alive. That night, Elizabeth held her children close and tried to memorize everything about them, the way Emma's hair curled around her ears, the constellation of freckles on Samuel's nose, the sweet weight of Grace as she slept. She told herself she was doing this for them, to give them a world where good people like Ayanna could exist. But deep in her heart, she knew it was more than that. Somewhere in the weeks they had spent together, she had fallen in love with the Apache chief. Not the desperate, grateful affection of a woman saved from certain death, but the deep, abiding love of someone who had found her perfect match in the most unlikely place. She loved his quiet strength, his fierce protection of his people, his gentle way with children. She loved the man who spoke more with his actions than his words, who had shown her what honor really meant. The next morning, Elizabeth kissed her sleeping children goodbye and slipped away from the camp before dawn. She had left a letter for Natan, written by firelight, asking him to tell Emma Samuel and Grace that their mother loved them more than life itself and had gone to try to save a friend who had saved them. She rode toward Fort Craig alone, carrying nothing but her father's old Bible and the truth about what had really happened in the mountains. Behind her, the sun rose over the peaks where Ayanna's people had found refuge. Ahead of her lay the unknown, and quite possibly death. But for the first time since Thomas had died, Elizabeth Harper felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. She was no longer running from her problems or letting others decide her fate. She was riding toward her destiny, whatever that might be. As the miles passed beneath her horse's hooves, Elizabeth thought about the question that had haunted her. Since the night in the caves, what did it mean to be truly free? She was beginning to think it had nothing to do with where you lived or what kind of life you led. True freedom came from choosing to do what was right, even when it cost you everything. The walls of Fort Craig appeared on the horizon just as the sun reached its peak. Elizabeth straightened her shoulders, whispered a prayer for courage, and rode toward whatever awaited her beyond those gates. The guards at Fort Craig stared in disbelief as Elizabeth rode up to the main gate. She was dressed in Apache clothing, her hair braided in the style the women had taught her, and her skin was deeply tanned from weeks in the mountain sun. To them, she must have looked like a white woman who had been completely transformed by her time among the Indians. "Ma'am, are you Elizabeth Harper?" the sergeant asked, his hand resting on his sidearm, as if he expected her to attack at any moment. "I am," Elizabeth replied, dismounting from her horse. "I understand you're holding Apache prisoners here. I need to speak with your commanding officer immediately." Within minutes, she found herself in the office of Colonel James Morrison, a career soldier with graying hair and suspicious eyes. He sat behind a massive wooden desk, studying Elizabeth as if she were some exotic creature he couldn't quite classify. "Mrs. Harper," the colonel said slowly, We were told you had been captured by the Apache chief, Ayanna. Marcus Blackwood reported that you had escaped and provided information about their location. Marcus Blackwood is a liar, Elizabeth said. Bluntly, I was never captured. I went to Apache territory voluntarily, and I stayed with Ayanna's people by choice. The colonel's eyebrows rose. Are you saying you willingly joined a band of hostiles? That's a serious accusation, ma'am. Some might call it treason. Elizabeth had expected this reaction. I'm saying that Ayanna and his people are not the savages you've been told they are. They treated me and my children with kindness and respect. They shared their food when we were hungry and protected us when we had nowhere else to go. Mrs. Harper, I think your ordeal has affected your judgment. It's not uncommon for captives to develop sympathetic feelings toward their captors. We've seen this before. Colonel Morrison, Elizabeth said firmly, I am in full possession of my faculties. I came here to tell you the truth about what happened, and to ask for the release of men who are guilty of nothing more than defending their families and their way of life. The colonel studied her for a long moment, then reached for a file on his desk. According to Mr. Blackwood's report, you were taken while traveling to Colorado. Is that correct? No, it's not. I was fleeing a debt that Marcus Blackwood knew I couldn't pay. He offered to forgive it if I would spy on Ayanna and report back about his activities and location. For the first time, the colonel looked genuinely surprised. You're saying Blackwood asked you to spy for him? I'm saying Marcus Blackwood has been trying to get the army to eliminate Ayanna for months, and he saw my desperate situation as an opportunity to provide you with an excuse to attack. Elizabeth leaned forward in her chair. Colonel, I spent weeks with these people. I know them. They're not the bloodthirsty killers you've been told about. Their families trying to survive, parents trying to protect their children. Colonel. Morrison was quiet for several minutes, making notes in the file. Finally, he looked up at her again. Mrs. Harper, even if what you're telling me is true, the fact remains that we have several Apache warriors in our custody who were engaged in armed resistance against the United States Army. They were defending themselves against an unprovoked attack, Elizabeth countered. If soldiers had surrounded your home and threatened your family, wouldn't you fight back? That's different. We represent lawful authority. Whose law, Elizabeth? Asked Ayanna's people were living on land that belonged to them long before any white man ever saw it. By what right do we claim authority over them? The colonel's face hardened. By right of conquest, Mrs. Harper. By right of superior civilization. The Apache way of life is ending, and the sooner they accept that, the better off everyone will. B. Elizabeth felt anger rising in her chest. Superior civilization? Is it superior to lie and cheat and murder to get what you want? Is it superior to turn children into orphans and wives into widows? Because that's what Marcus Blackwood's superior civilization tried to do to me and my children? Mrs. Harper, you're clearly distraught. I think you should rest, and we'll continue this conversation tomorrow. I want to see Ayanna, Elizabeth said firmly. But that's impossible. The prisoners are being held under military guard, pending their trial. What trial? What are the charges against them? Colonel Morrison consulted his file again. Armed resistance to lawful authority, theft of livestock, destruction of government property. Those are lies, and you know it. The only livestock they ever took was cattle that wandered onto their traditional hunting grounds. And what government property did they destroy? The colonel was growing impatient with her questions. Mrs. Harper, I've been very patient with. You, but my patience is wearing thin. You've admitted to consorting with known enemies of the United States. Under different circumstances, you could be charged as an accomplice to their crimes. Elizabeth stood up, her back straight and her voice steady. Then charge me, Colonel. Put me on trial alongside them. Let me tell a jury what really happened in those mountains. For a moment, the two stared at each other across the desk. Then Colonel Morrison sighed and rubbed his temples. Mrs. Harper, what exactly do you want from me? I want you to release Ayanna and his warriors. I want you to acknowledge that this entire military action was based on false information provided by Marcus Blackwood for his own financial gain. And I want you to guarantee safe passage for Ayanna's people to return to their families. And in return, Elizabeth had been thinking about this since she left the Apache camp. In return, I'll testify against Marcus Blackwood. I'll tell everyone who will listen about his scheme to use my children and me as pawns in his effort to steal Apache land. I'll make sure the territorial government knows exactly what kind of man they've been taking advice from." The colonel considered this proposal. Elizabeth could see him weighing the political implications of her offer against the military advantage of keeping Ayanna imprisoned. There would have to be conditions, he said finally. Ayanna and his people would have to agree to remain on the reservation. No more raids, no more resistance to federal authority. "You'll have to ask Ayanna about that," Elizabeth replied. "But I can tell you that all he ever wanted was for his people to live in peace on their ancestral lands." Evening, under heavy guard, Elizabeth was allowed to visit the prison building where Ayanna and his warriors were being held. The conditions were harsh, bare cells with no windows and barely enough room to lie down. But when Ayanna saw her, his face lit up with a mixture of joy and concern. "Elizabeth," he said, gripping the bars of his cell, "you should not be here. It is dangerous for you." "More dangerous than living with a band of Apache outlaws," she replied with a small smile. "Why did you come?" Elizabeth looked into his dark eyes and saw her future reflected there. Not the future she had planned as Thomas Harper's wife, or the future Marcus Blackwood had tried to force on her, but the future she was choosing for herself. "Because I love you," she said simply. "Because you showed me what it means to live with honor and courage, because you're worth fighting for." Ayanna reached through the bars and touched her face gently. "And I love you, Elizabeth Harper. From the first night by the fire, when you chose truth over safety, I have loved you." As Elizabeth rode away from Fort Craig the next morning, she carried with her Colonel Morrison's promise to reconsider the charges against Ayanna and his men. More importantly, she carried the memory of Ayanna's whispered words as she left. "Wait for me. However long it takes, wait for me." Behind her, the walls of the fort grew smaller in the distance. Ahead of her, the mountains where her children waited looked like home. And somewhere between the two, Elizabeth Harper discovered that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not when you set out to find something new, but when you finally understand what you've been searching for all along.